Good morning, good morning, good morning, and good morning. Welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is labor unions versus a country in its socio-economic development and the economic welfare of its citizens in its economic development. But fellows, today's subject has to do with the current situation going on in Nigeria's oil industry between the unions of Nigeria's oil industry, Pengasson, Dupen, and Dapman, against the world's largest single-train oil refinery, Dangote Oil Refinery. And this labor dispute, according to Pengasson, has also held pretty much Nigeria's economy in hostage, where some people are even calling it economic sabotage. But I'll get back to all of that later. But fellows, before I dive into this subject today, I would like to give a brief history of unions and how unions came to be. Because I'm a strong advocate of union and I like unions. Unions have been very good to mankind, especially to labor, to every society in the world. It has helped in the economic development of various countries around the world, as well as also raised the standard of the living and the welfare of citizens of pretty much every country in the world. And this goes back to about in the 18th, 17th century, during the Industrial Revolution, when unions started taking shape. I mean, one of the first known unions was the Shoemaker Unions of Philadelphia. That was organized and started around 1764, as well as the Journeyman Tailors Union, also from New York. That was also around in the mid 18th century. And these were members of these organizations that were going through horrible working conditions from their employers. I mean, you're talking about the mid 18th century. I mean, we're not talking about today. I mean, mid 18th century, during the Industrial Revolution, I mean, working conditions were very horrible. So these guys have to form unions to fight against these working conditions. And that was the beginning of unionization all across the industrial world, Europe and America. And out of these organizations also came with good benefits for its workers. And in the end, laid the foundation and the groundwork that eventually, about 100 and 150 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1934 signed the Labor Law Act, to give workers the opportunity to join unions in America. I mean, it took that long for the federal government of the United States under Roosevelt to sign into law. I mean, as a matter of fact, it was 1933, the Labor Law Act, that gave American workers and federal workers the right to organize as a union. So now it became the law of the land. Just 1933. From the mid 18th century all the way to 1933. That's when officially the US government signed it into law for workers to be able to organize as a union. And from that point, you can tell the benefits of these unions. I mean, just around that time also came about the Davis-Bacon Act. I mean, this was an act passed by Davis and Bacon, two congressmen, that guaranteed that every federal contract that is given to workers in America have to meet certain standards in terms of working conditions and wages. So it coincided with this act by Roosevelt. And this Davis-Bacon Act is said to be the foundation of what eventually led to the minimum wage laws, as well as also the laws that pretty much stabilized wages for working men and women in the United States of America. So looking at all of this, you can tell the benefits that unions have given to its citizens of the world, as well as its members of its labor organizations. But for unions to thrive in any society, they also have to work hand in hand with their employers, within the institutions that these unions reside in. Because without the employers, there will be no union. And without union, there will be no, without employers, there will be no union. And employers also need workers for them to be able to achieve the goal of the institution or the organization or the company. But sometimes, out of the goodwill of great organizations also can create good working conditions for workers, even if there is no unions in that organization. One that comes to mind is Ford Motor Company, that was founded by Henry Ford. And I know a lot of people might not know this. The 5-day, 40-hour work week that we have today was arbitrarily started by Henry Ford in 1926. There were no unions in Ford Motor Company at that time. But Henry Ford himself decided to establish that 40-hour working day for its workers. Because he believed that if you give workers the opportunity to have days to rest and so on and so forth, it will increase productivity at his factories. And it was this same Ford also that pretty much came up with the mantra that if the workers that build his Model T Ford cars cannot afford to buy those cars, then he hasn't done anything. So they should be able to build cars that the workers at his plants that build these cars can be able to afford to buy these cars and drive these cars. So it started with some of these great industrialists like Henry Ford as well. Even though at that time, Ford Motor Company didn't have union. But through his own goodwill and his business acumen and understanding the psyche of human development, decided that when you create good working environment for workers, in the end, it goes to benefit your organization. And that's what Henry Ford did. And it is that model, 5-day, 40-hour work week, is what today has become the uniform world order for all companies and everywhere, every part of the world today abide by. It didn't start with unions. It didn't start by law. It started by Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company. So sometimes, yes, when you organize workers, workers will fight for the rights of their workers and so on and so forth, but also it has to work in hand with management of the organizations that these workers reside in for them to achieve the goal of building a great organization. But fellas, now let's dive straight into what happened in Nigeria last week with regards to the shutting down and the strike by the Nigerian Oil Industry Association, unions, and so on and so forth. That also pretty much almost crippled the Nigerian economy to some extent, because the Nigerian government had to lose billions of dollars because of the strike that the Oil Industry Workers Association, or Pengasson, called against Dangote Oil Refinery. And this apparently started with when Pengasson decided to form union organization within the Dangote Oil Refinery. And for some reason, according to the news report, Pengassi received a letter from Dangote that its members, 800 workers, have been fired or are being reassigned to other Dangote industries due to restructuring of the company, which didn't sit well with Pengassi, the oil and gas industry union organization in Nigeria. So they decided to negotiate, and apparently the negotiations didn't go nowhere. So they decided to call a strike, thereby shutting down oil crude supply to not even only Dangote oil refinery, but to NNPC and other modular oil refineries. So pretty much a union, an oil and gas union organization in Nigeria, decided to shut down crude supply, turn off the valves for crude supply, as well as anything involving energy to Nigeria, because of its 800 workers, according to them, have been dismissed or were being reassigned according to Dangote oil refinery. So these 800 workers and the Pengassi union decided to pretty much hold Nigerian government and its citizens hostage. It is unfortunate for me to get into the point of calling this as a hostage or sabotage. But fellas, before we look deep into this issue, you have to go back to when Dangote oil refinery started operating in Nigeria. And this is the problem that Africa faces in its socioeconomic development. Look, I'm a staunch believer in unions. As a former rep of unions and labor, having understand the ins and outs of how these organizations work within organizations, I staunchly believe unions are great for workers. Unions don't just benefit the workers that they represent. They go all the way to benefit pretty much all workers within a society or a country. If the management of an organization benefits from union activities when it comes to wages and their bargaining rights, that eventually goes to affect everybody. So union activities, when done right, benefit society. But there also comes a time you have to ask yourselves, what kind of unions do you have? Do you have unions that are corrupt and politically aligned for their own selfish needs, or unions that are really there to benefit its members, which is the hard working men and women of that organization? That is the question that we have to ask ourselves with regards to this situation going on right now in Nigeria, with regards to Pengassi, Lupen, and Dapman, against Nigeria's and Africa's, as well as the world's biggest oil refinery, single train oil refinery. And looking back at what is going on right now with regards to this situation, you can tell clearly that this is not just about workers' rights and so forth. Because like I said earlier, when Dangote oil refinery first came into being in Nigeria, somewhere last year, there was all these cabals. I mean, these are people who have been in the oil industry in Nigeria. These are organizations, both in the midstream, upstream, and downstream of Nigerian oil and gas industry, who have pretty much held Nigeria down for so many years. And for them to see an industrialist like Aliko Dangote come in and build a refinery, eventually taking down the subsidies that these organizations have been eating into. I mean, these people have been pretty much killing Nigeria economy. They've been eating into these subsidies. And now you have Nigeria, Dangote coming in, building this refinery. Therefore, the government ending up cutting off these subsidies. Now, Dangote also deciding that, well, look, I'm going to bring in my own trucks, CNG trucks, bypassing these middlemen who have been holding him hostage Because at the end of the day, if he produces the oil, it turns into PMS, gasoline, and he sends it to these depots that are run by these cabals, and they decide how much to add to whatever they bought from Dangote, plus where to send it to and how to ship it and so on and so forth, they can always hold him hostage. And Dangote have been gradually understanding the business to know where these people are in terms of what they want to do and what they are trying to do to make sure that he doesn't succeed in Nigeria oil business as far as he's eating into their profit margins. And that is where this issue of Pengasson, this Nigerian Oil Union Association, and Dapman and Dupen, that's where they become so very fuzzy and funny. Because if you look at what Pengasson was arguing about, in terms of the 800 workers that were reassigned according to Dangote Industries, Pengasson did not just shut their union members in Dangote Oil Refinery. They went across the board against all the oil industry in Nigeria. And this begs the question that yes, unions have the right, to organize and so on and so forth. Eventually, they have to go to court if they want to strike and so on and so on. But in a country where there's rule of law, I don't understand how a union organization can shut the valve of crude oil to other organizations that has nothing to do with their labor dispute with Dangote Oil Refinery. Because if Pengasson is having an issue with Dangote Oil Refinery, why should they shut the valve for crude supply to NNPC and other modular refineries in Nigeria? Pretty much bringing Nigeria to its knees because of their strike. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So NNPC couldn't put up a fight and other refineries couldn't put up a fight against Pengasson when it had nothing to do with their dispute with Dangote Oil Refinery. This smells like something fuzzy was going on, doesn't it? Because if you look at it, it doesn't make sense. And that is what Pengasson did. They pretty much went against all the oil industry operators in Nigeria. That's what they did. So that goes to ask the question, was this about labor dispute between Dangote and Pengasson, or this was about a bigger issue involving Dangote's decision to either transport and supply its gas, petroleum products directly to petrol stations in Nigeria and cutting out these middlemen who have been eating into this industry for over 50, 60 years now. And now all of a sudden he comes in and he started chopping them down block by block. And they're seeing it. So that they are aligned with the union to do the dirty work for them. That's how I see it, fellas. I don't see it any other way other than that. It is unfortunate. It is unfortunate because if you look at every country's socioeconomic development, at some point, you need people like Dangote, industries like Dangote Industries, to help a country in its socioeconomic development. And it's sad that a country like Nigeria, with its all natural resources, continue to go through this. And this doesn't stop with just Dangote Oil Refineries, fellas. I mean, look, what happened in Nigeria with regards to the oil industry, Pengasson, Dupen, and Dapman, and Dangote Oil Refinery, should be a sign or warning to all investors who have interest or want to invest either in Nigeria or other parts of Africa or developing countries. Because unions, like I said earlier, have been very good for workers. There's nothing wrong having unions. I mean, the labor laws in Nigeria guarantees the right for workers to unionize. Same way employers also have rights to accept unions in their organizations and to work within that confines to make sure that It benefits both the employer and the workers. There's nothing wrong with that. But when unions now think that they are bigger than their own shoes and allow with political parties in their various countries to use it to sabotage a country, that is another issue. And that is exactly what happened in Nigeria last week by the Oil Union and Gas Association, PENGAS. Because if you look at what happened, this was done deliberately to force Dangote's hand. But unfortunately for these unions in oil industry, Dangote's train has already left the station. Dangote's train has already left the station. All these cabals in the oil industry in Nigeria, they have to know this by now. Dangote is bigger than Nigeria right now. Dangote currently exports Jet A1 fuel, PMS. I mean, we're talking about PMS petrol to America. I mean, and the saddest truth about this is this was the same Dangote PMS petrol that the Nigerian regulator last year said that Dangote's petrol was not of a good standard. So they gave more licenses to these petrol importers in Nigeria, PMS importers in Nigeria, to import more PMS into Nigeria, whilst Dangote was still producing PMS in Nigeria. So they came up with this excuse, a way to grant more licenses. In other words, to create more competition, which is good. There's nothing wrong having competition. But it was a way to force the hand of Dangote Oil Refinery because they wanted to make sure that these oil cabals still have a way to force Dangote's hand. But meanwhile, Dangote Oil in the refinery is exporting petrol, PMS, to America. There's no country on this planet that I know of that has higher standard when it comes to certain things, especially industrial products, petrol, PMS, and other stuff, than the United States of America. So for Dangote to be able to export to the United States, that tells you something. It must have a very high-grade product. And he just doesn't export to the United States. He exports to Europe. He exports to Asia. He exports to Saudi Arabia. I mean, all over across Africa and the world. So Dangote, in terms of the oil industry, his train have already left the station. And it's about time these oil cabals learn that. Either they form a union to go and build their own refinery, because at the end of the day, look, the Nigerian government issued about 31 licenses, from what I heard, for people who want to build refineries to go ahead and build refineries. Because these people going out there crying out loud and complaining about Dangote Oil Refinery being a monopoly, all that nonsense. Meanwhile, they have about 31 licenses that was issued to these organizations. And the funny thing about it is, these are the same unions that connive with the 3 refineries in Nigeria that the federal government of Nigeria have pumped in about $1.5 to $2.5 billion for the past 10 or 15 years. About 1.5 to 2.5 or $4 billion. And still, these refineries in Kaduna, Port Harcourt, and Warri doesn't work. I mean, go figure, fellas. It is unfortunate. But the key issue to this subject today is about whether Africans have to look at the unions in a way to make sure that they tamp down these unions so that these unions don't get out of hand. Because what happened last week in Nigeria is a union gone amok. And the Nigerian government should never have allowed that to happen. From what I heard and from what I read, the union did not even follow the processes that they are supposed to follow before they even go on a strike. And I also heard that there was a court order that also asked them to turn back on the valves, and they refused. And this goes beyond even the union. This goes to the core issue of Africa's socioeconomic development problem, Africa's problem, which is the rule of law. You see, because yes, you have the right to have a union, you have the right to call for a strike, but there are processes that you have to go through. And if a union think it's too big that the country as a whole can decide to do that and face no consequences, that tells you the kind of country you live in. So in this instance, as much as I hate what happened, I'm not even going to put 100% blame on the union. It's the kind of country you live in. Because if you live in a country where rule of law works, there's no way this union can turn off valve and go against court order. It can never happen in the developed system, a country where rule of law works. So this goes to tell you that you live in a very corrupt system, a system that rule of law doesn't work. I mean, and it's very, very unfortunate because at the core of all of this is the rule of law. The core of all of this is the rule of law. Yes, you have the right to do what you want to do. You have the right to call for a strike against your employer and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you have to follow the law if the law works in that system. But for a union to take the law into its own hands and for the federal government of Nigeria not to react to that, I'm sorry. It is unfortunate, but this is the problem you face. And for some reason, I don't even hear the Nigerian media or anybody be calling this out. You know, because at the end of the day, if you look at this thing, it should never happen. As a matter of fact, the union leaders should have been sanctioned by the law, the courts, to find, for them to pay heavy fines for every day that they did not abide by the law of telling them to go back and open the valves. And if they did not follow the rule that has been given by the judge, the federal government should intervene and either to disband the union or to put sanctions on the union. You know, I mean, look, we all talk about Africa's socioeconomic development, the importance of economic development for Africa and so on and so forth. If you look at Africa's socioeconomic development and people talk about the model, sometimes you hear people talk about model, talk about China, talk about, you know, how China is and all. What happened in Nigeria last week, my fellow brothers and sisters? It can never happen in China. China have unions, but China's union is controlled by the Communist Party. And if you look at most of these unions in Africa, the Trade Union Congress and all these associations in Africa, they are all communist-linked unions. Okay? They operate like Communist Party unions. So they believe in dictatorship. They believe in imposing their will on the citizens of their various countries that they are residing. And that's what they do. Because you look at China, you look at Russia, all those unions down there are run by the governments. So the unions don't have power. You cannot strike in China. I mean, that is why it's so very dangerous in terms of when you talk about competing. You can never compete fairly with China. When it comes to anything, manufacturing and all that, it's very, very difficult to compete with China because China don't have laws that govern their manufacturing industry and so on and so forth. So because they don't have strong unions that can challenge the authority of the government, basically it's what the government tells the union to do is what the union does. So what happened in Nigeria last week with regards to Pengasson can never happen in China. And I heard the president of the union of Pengasson, they call him a comrade. And I'm like, hold on, give me a break. They call him comrade. I mean, this is a communist. That is what they are. These are communist people. They believe in dictatorship. So at the end of the day, they are corrupt because they believe that either their way or the highway. These people don't believe in the rights of workers for Nigerians. These people don't believe in the great welfare of the citizens of Nigeria. These people are corrupt leaders who believe in what benefits them. Everything that is going on in Nigeria today with regards to this oil sector industry, it's not about workers' right. They are using this workers as a pawn. As a pawn, that's what they are doing. These people have connived with the oil cabals in Nigeria. That's all this is about. These people have connived with the oil cabals in Nigeria, and their goal is to make sure that they go back to the old ways of doing business, that they have enriched themselves and made Nigeria worse and worse and worse. So with Dangote coming in now and them seeing the impact that Dangote is having on that country, which is helping Nigeria become more developed gradually, they don't wonder. These people don't believe in that, because at the end of the day, it's all about them. That is what this is all about. I mean, it is unfortunate. I mean, it's sad that to see that when people invest huge sums of money to help in the socioeconomic development of a country, and then you have these people who have captured unions and groups that uses its workers as pawns to advance the objectives of their cabals that they have connived with. That is very sad. These people are not there for the interest of the citizens of Nigeria. And this is not just Nigeria, fellas. If you look at most African countries, and you look at the reason why Africa is where it is today, and it saddens to say this, but this is how it's going to be, fellas. As far as you have situations like this on that continent, Africa is not going to develop. Because I've done programs and I've talked about it. You are not going to be developed by getting stipends, aids from Western countries, Japan, China, and all that stuff. It ain't happening. The only way Africa is going to develop is through foreign direct investment through the private sector. China that you sit in Africa and you talk about. China without the United States of America, foreign direct investment into China would never be what it is today. Everything you see in China today is because of the United States of America's private sector investment in that country. From Walmart, Target, Apple, Amazon, going back 30, 40 years ago. They made what China is today. I don't want to hear it. If you want it, go find it. Go ask the Chinese themselves, they will tell you. Without American money, China will never be where it is today. But you have to create the environment for people to come and invest in your countries. But if you can do this to your own son, a man who spends 20 billion US dollars, I mean, this man, he says it all the time, could have invested this in Apple or Tesla or Oracle or Google and so on and so forth, and he would have been worth over 100 and something billions today, looking at the stock prices of these companies today. But he chose to invest that money to help with the socioeconomic development of Nigeria. And this is what he gets from the oil cabals conniving with the unions in the name of workers' rights. Are you kidding me, fellows? I mean, I'm a strong advocate of workers' rights. But you don't hold a whole country of over 240 to 300 million people hostage just because you didn't get your way with the Dangote oil refinery and costing that country billions of dollars. Are you kidding me? And it is only in a corrupt system that organization will be working and be operating freely today. Because this is not going to happen in any country where rule of law works. First of all, you cannot even strike without going through the process. It's not supposed to happen. But these people did it anyway, and they think they are proud of what they did. And the government is sitting out there acting like a toothless bulldog. Can't do anything about it. I mean, but meanwhile, they forget that this was a bad signal to the rest of the investment world. Period. Because at the end of the day, look at it, fellows. I mean, what has happened right now? If you're sitting down in your country in Europe or wherever you are, and you holding, let's say 5, even 10, 15 million, and every little money that you have, and you looking at maybe investing in any African country or Nigeria for whatever, and you asking yourself this question: do I want to go and put my money in a system that is controlled by a few crony capitalist, corrupt union organizations that can hijack or hold me for ransom in the name of protecting workers' rights? Or I have to look at the Western world and put my money in the Western world? And this is a question that investors are going to ask themselves. And a lot of investors are asking themselves these questions. And it's not just Nigeria. That's what I'm saying. This thing that happened between Pengasson, Nupen, and Dapman and Dangote Oil is reverberating all across the investment world and Africa. Because all these people are looking at Africa, because in the first place, they are already suspicious of the political and economic environment of investing on the continent already. And then now they're seeing, looking at this, they look at it and say, hold on. These unions can hold my company or basically hijack my company in the name of workers' rights if they have that authority, which it seems that like the federal government of Nigeria have given them. It is sad. I mean, unions, as great as unions can be, should never be allowed to hijack the economy of a country, period. It should never be allowed. I mean, look, if you want to talk about this issue about unions, you go back and you look at even in America and Europe. I'm going to touch a little bit on that. Unions have been great, but sometimes also unions have also contributed to some of the problems that the workers face in their various countries. And looking at the industrial sector of Europe in particular, the unions aligned with political parties were bent on going to the last minute to take as much as they can from employers, to the extent that they contributed to a lot of these industries in Europe that eventually moved out of Europe into China and other Southeastern Asian countries. As much as they work hard for their workers, at some point also, they played a role, because look, at the end of the day, look, you have the right to organize, you have the right to bargain in wages and all, so on and so forth. But at some point also, we got to understand that these employers, companies, also have a right to either to continue investing in the same system or to move their companies somewhere else. America, case in point, in the United States of America. I talked about Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company. He came up with the 5-day, 40-hour work week voluntarily. And now that is the standard all over the world. He wasn't forced by union. There were no unions at that time in Ford. He came up with it because he believed that that would increase productivity. When you set up good working environment for your workers. But guess what, fellows? During the mid-60s and 70s also, when unions became very rampant in the auto industry in America, Detroit, when American auto industry was booming, you didn't face that much competition from Japan back then. So the union workers benefited a lot from America's economy in the 70s all the way through the 80s. At some point, when they started facing this stiff competition from Japanese auto industry, Toyota, Honda, and so on, flooding America with their cars, the profit margin of these big three, I mean Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford, wasn't as great as it used to be. So with union organizations, which were very, very powerful, back then compared to today, negotiating with these companies, for wages and so on and so forth, at some point, they wouldn't back down. They kept going for the same old wage increases and benefits and stuff, that had been good to them when the things were very good for these three auto makers, car makers in America. And guess what happened, fellas? These Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. Today we're talking about Trump talking about bringing jobs back, factories, by imposing all these higher tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Decided to move across to Canada and Mexico. So in some cases, in cases, what they do is they produce a lot of the parts in these places at a cheaper rate and bring them back here and assemble these cars here at their Detroit plants. And these legacy costs, union agreements that have been in place between these unions and the auto industry in America would never help these companies. So they had no choice. Their hands were they were tied. Their hands were tied. So they felt that for them to get away from it, so instead of building more plants and increasing their productivity in America, they decided to go across the border, which is unfortunate, but that is what happened. And then when these Japanese and foreign automakers also decided to come to America and invest, guess what? They didn't go to Detroit because they didn't want to deal with the unions in Detroit. So you come to America today, you go to the southern states where they call the right to work states. So basically, you can establish a factory down there. You don't have to have union members in your factory and produce there. So you go to Tennessee, you have Nissan. You go to Alabama, you go to South Carolina, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and all these European and Japanese car companies, all of them in these southern states, helping the boom of these southern states' economies. So yes, like I said earlier, unions can be great. You know, they are great for workers. They've done very well for workers, not just for only the workers in their union, but also for workers in general. Because at the end of the day, when they fight for their workers, it goes to benefit. It trickles down to other industries in terms of wages and working conditions and so on and so forth. So unions have been great, but at some point also, unions have to realize that, look, we have to look at what is good for the employer too, the industries that we operate in, so that we can work with these industries to maintain decent working environment and wages for our workers, but without forcing the hand of these, industries to move abroad or to China and other places. This is not to say that, some of these companies moved outside just because of the unions and so on. Yes, unions might have played a role, but I also have to understand also greedy and corrupt and greedy and corporate shareholders also wanted more from their investment. So they also contributed to it. It wasn't just because the unions were fighting for higher wages and so on. Not just that. There were other factors that also contributed to moving of jobs from America to Mexico and Canada and eventually to China. And like I said, China don't operate under no unions. Their union is run by the communist dictatorship. So you have no right. Your right is what the communist China government tells you. And that is what pretty much the unions in Africa today are taking advantage of. Now they are in bed with most political parties. See, that's the saddest truth. So they are aligned with political parties. So what they think they have so much power, so they can dictate to what happens to their socioeconomic development of Africa. And that is very wrong for Africa. That is very, very wrong, because if Africans don't rid themselves off of unions that are corrupt and tied to political parties, I'm sorry, we are not going to get developed in any time soon. It ain't happening, because most foreign direct investments looking at the role of unions in your countries are not going to come down there, especially from what happened to Dangote Industries just quite recently. I hope there's just a black eye to Nigeria's FDI investment coming. I hope so, because the Nigerian government have to do something about this. They cannot let this go. I'm sorry, fellas. The Nigerian federal government have to do something about this, because the rule of law that is supposed to take care of this failed. It failed the Nigerian citizens and it failed Nigerian industries. It failed abysmally. It failed because if there's rule of law in Nigeria, this thing should never have happened. The unions will have to follow the process and done exactly what the law requires of them to do. But because of the rule of law doesn't work in our systems on the continent, that is why a union can hijack and sabotage a great industry and a country and pretty much put the whole country's economy to the brink of losing billions and billions of dollars within days. And these union leaders and union organizations is still operating like it's normal. Should be ashamed of yourselves. All right, fellas, if it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and have a great week. Thank you guys and peace and love.